Hi there, guys. We're going to be discussing the first three chapters of the novel Tsotsi. You'll see on the left hand side, this is the edition of the book that I'll be using. So any page numbers that I include will be referenced to this copy. And I'm also using some screenshots from the film Tsotsi. That will help you, just provide you with some visuals. Please note that the narratives are, although similar, very different in a few key areas. So it's important that you maintain focus on the narrative of the novel, not on the film. And one of the greatest differences is that the film is set in the early 2000s, whereas the novel is set in the 1950s. So let's stick to the novel. All right. It's set in an unnamed township outside Joburg. It's the apartheid era, and the focus is on the meaningless cycle of life. And what does that mean? Really just means that people lack any form of purpose. There's nothing to do. They're unemployed. They're surrounded by crime, hate, fear, and a whole lot of drinking. And the start of the novel begins inside Tsotsi's house, where there are four gang members, and I'm going to introduce properly in about 2 slides from now. But the three of them here are gossiping, making small talk, basically waiting for the shadows to be long enough. This is Tsotsi over here, who's the youngest member, but also the gang leader. Tsotsi meaning gangster. So that's fitting, obviously. That is not actually his real name, but that's the name he goes by. That's the name people know him by. And a lot of the focus in the novel is on darkness and lightness. And the darkness often comes through the use of shadows, and the lightness can come through the street lamp. But it's not always about literal dark and light. Darkness representing evil, wrong, bad, lack of God, lack of direction, things like that. And lightness representing more good and redemption. And redemption is a major theme in the novel, but we can only get to that in a few more chapters' time. And once Tsotsi decides that this is what we're going to be doing tonight, because he hasn't really been saying much at this point, he hasn't been saying anything really. He decides that they're going to be going to the train station to commit a crime. That's the job that they're going to be doing. And that provides them with a purpose. Beforehand, they don't really have a purpose. But the fact that they've got a job to do, and that is to go and steal from somebody or to kill somebody or both, that provides them with a purpose. And it's a sad reality. All right. And he says that the shadows are long enough. In other words, obviously you want it to be dark so people don't see you committing these crimes. Okay, so the shadows are long enough, the sun is setting. Interesting to note how Butcher reacts to the news. Now, I haven't told you who Butcher is yet, but I don't really need to tell you much. The fact that his name is Butcher pretty much indicates that he's probably a really good killer. Okay. Now he smiles and laughs at the news that they're going to go to the train station to do a job. Now that shows a lack of empathy, no consideration, no morals, completely cold personality. In fact, the simile here, sharp as a knife blade, is quite fitting in that his name's Butcher. He's going to actually go and grab a bicycle spoke to do the crime, and it's a knife blade, which is just a hint at violence, or how do we say, a link to violence that's going to come. Okay. But Boston is the one gang member who is quite clever, very good at telling stories, in a sense that when they're sitting around, nobody really knows what to say. First of all, nothing really happens, and then if you want to say like, oh, I slept with this girl last night, then they say that, and then that's the end of the story. They're not good at telling stories. But Boston is. So Boston is nice to have around because he provides some entertainment, and he fills that void of silence that there is. But the problem is, and I say a problem in terms of Tsotsi's point of view, but obviously you and I know it's not a bad thing, is that Boston doesn't enjoy the jobs that they do, even though he's part of this gang. He's part of this gang, he doesn't have a choice really, but he hates killing people, and Tsotsi knows that, and he knows that Tsotsi knows that. So when it says here that Tsotsi was watching Boston, in other words, when he says, listen, we're going to go and do a job on the trains, he watches Boston to see now how's he going to react. and Boston knows that he's being watched, so he actually just keeps his eyes down because he doesn't want to make eye contact with Tsotsi. Alright. Now, it also tells us on the bottom of page 5 that leaving the room for the backyard where you rested against a hot corrugated iron fence with an outstretched arm and pushed into the sand and watched you soak up and draw away before you had left the spot. When Tsotsi decides to make this decision and tells everybody, his telling them is interrupted, for example, by having to go outside and pee. Okay. The lack of purpose and the lack of time constraints, there's no rush, is there, means that you could go outside and pee and then actually stare at it and wait for the urine to be soaked up by the sand and then go back inside. Because what's the rush? There's nothing else to do in your life. Even says that sometimes when he does things like that, Tsotsi will come back and he will wonder whether the gang even knows what he was talking about. And sometimes they say, yeah, you were saying this, and sometimes they say nothing because they don't care. No one's actually really listening. But anyway, they leave the room and now they're making their way towards the train station. Now these are the 4 gang members, and their names usually tell us something. So Diop, it says on page 6, so called because of his long arms, his knuckles seemed to drag in the dust. Listens very carefully to what Tsotsi says, doesn't really say anything though, isn't very clever. Alright. Tsotsi, as I mentioned, the gang member, about 20 years old, youngest of the members. Okay. Not very stupid, but obviously lacks education. Alright. Then we have Boston, who we already know doesn't like killing and stuff, drinks a lot. Why do you think he drinks so much? Because he needs to be really drunk when he commits these crimes so that he doesn't feel too much of a conscience. And yeah, because he feels like if he was sober he wouldn't want to do it, or he might resist. He wants to try and drown his guilt. Okay. And then we have Butcher, who it says has small dangerous eyes, like sinister eyes, and of course he's very good at killing. He also is not the smartest either, but you see, it's all he knows, this gang that he's in, and the violence that surrounds it. It's all he's ever known. It says that Boston's stories were of no consequence. In other words, he's full of hot air. He talks and talks and talks, but they don't really mean anything. Until just now, when he starts talking, it means something. Anyway, and it tells us a little bit about what the street is like outside. It says they see the shadows long after the man has disappeared. And you see that it's Friday night, and people are concerned when they see the gang coming. Mothers are calling their sons in from outside and things like that, because they are scared now of what this gang is going to do. They all know they're a gang, and they're terrified because they know they're going to do something. It says there on page 9 that the gang were harbingers of the night. In other words, forerunners of the night. Whatever that night held, they were going to cause some form of chaos. They were going to do something. So they were forerunners, or yeah, they would introduce the chaos of the night, as it were. And when they get to the train station, they're kind of just looking around, but Tsotsi is the one who makes decisions here. And so he's looking now, and he's saying, where can I find somebody? Now, just to backtrack a little bit, Boston tries to make an excuse before they get there as to why they should not do the job. And he makes up, not the real reason, of course, but he says, sometimes you pick one and he's got nothing. In other words, sometimes you choose a guy, or girl, or woman, or whatever, and they don't have any money. So you try and rob them, but they don't have anything. But Tsotsi then says, I never make a mistake. That shows his great level of confidence and, of course, arrogance as well. And Diop nods and says, that's true, he never makes a mistake. He always chooses somebody who has something. And so, how does he choose the person on this Friday night? He chooses a guy by the name of Gumboot Dlamini. Alright? Unfortunately, Gumboot didn't know that he was the chosen one until it was too late, because they gave him no warning. And then it goes on to say that Gumboot was a man, measured in hope, he stood in his shoes, tall amongst men. Now, On page 9, bottom of page 9 and page 10, it gives us a little bit of a story of Gumboot Dlamini. The reason for that is because if he was to die or get robbed, or both, but we had no idea who he was, we would feel less for him. But now that we know who he is as a person, it makes the crime that much more evil, that much more wrong, and we feel a sense of, we feel sorry for Gumboot. Okay, so a little bit about Gumboot, right? He has a wife at home called Makmulu. He left her pregnant about a year ago, and she watched him disappearing, and he walked for a long way to Joburg to go and work on the mines. And on his way, he worked once, and he used the money, and he bought himself a pair of shoes, and he wrapped them up in his blanket. And then he wore through these shoes eventually, and then he had them mended, and then he wore through them again and wore through them again. And it says there at the bottom of page 10, he travelled safe for a year because he heeded the advice of others. And in that same year he worked hard and earned well and wore through the new shoes he had bought on the road and then had them mended, blah, blah, blah. Page 11, Makmulu would be getting back a man very much the same as he had left, with his laugh still big, his hands that were generous in the gestures of love, and even his shoes still as high as hope. Okay, so he's a good man, he works hard for his money, he loves his wife loves him. He's going to see his wife in a week's time, because it says on that Friday night train going back to the township where he's staying a week before going home. Unfortunately for him, Butcher knew with unfailing accuracy the position of the heart. Now, what's very important is that he had made 3 mistakes. In other words, why was he chosen? He was chosen for these 3 mistakes. Now, the first one, and this is important, is he smiled. Okay, the poor guy, he gets chosen for smiling, and it tells us how he has a nice smile and such a big laugh and generous hands and things like that. So we feel sorry for the guy. The second thing is that he was wearing this red, flaming red tie with bolts of silver lightning on it. Now, it tells us how he got it and all that, but the bright tie makes it easy for Tsotsi to follow him at a distance. Okay, and then the third mistake that he made was that he paid for, he paid for his train ticket using his pay packet. And when you do that, people can see how much money you have, that you have money in there. And so Tsotsi knows that he has money on him. Alright. So they all get in the train, and there's Butcher with his bicycle spoke, and they surround him, and he doesn't realize it at first. It also mentions on page 12 that he has a writing man coming to his room at 6:30, and there was still half an hour walk from the station. So we get the impression that, well, probably Gumboot doesn't know how to write or read, and so he's had to pay somebody to come to his house in the township where he's staying to write a letter to his wife so that he can send it. That's nice. That's sweet. Unfortunately, he's not going to get there because it says, Tsotsi smiled at the growing bewilderment on the big bastard's face, waiting for and catching the explosion of darkness in the eyes as Butcher worked the spoke up and into his heart. Tsotsi bent close to the dying man and in his ear whispered an obscene reference to his mother. Wow. The guy's dying, and the last thing he hears is an ugly reference to his mother. That's a really, really evil thing to do. A moment of hate at the last, he had learned, disfigured the face in death. So Tsotsi loves the fact that this man is going to die with that on the being the last thing on his mind. It's going to disfigure his face. He's going to die angry. He's going to die unhappy. That cruelty is what Tsotsi lives by. It's all he knows. You see, because him as a gangster is an identity. Without that, he has no identity because he doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know where he comes from. He has little bits of memory flashbacks that he purposefully pushes out of his mind because he doesn't want to allow them to overtake his mind, because he's obviously going to become upset and angry and things like that. So he just forces it out. But giving himself the title of Tsotsi, making himself this gangster, provides him with a purpose, and it provides him with an identity. And so they hold on to the guy so nobody notices that he's dead, and then when everybody leaves the train, they drop him and he falls to the floor, and nobody knows how he died. Okay, So that ends chapter 1. Then, chapter 2 starts off at Suki's place. Now, Suki is the owner of a shebeen. She's a colored woman in her 50s. And it says on page 17 that she'd been born in the best bed in the biggest house of the best European suburb in the city, but her mother never loved her, and that was why she lived in the township. I wrote regular, she always said at the end of her story. I've got the address, but I got no replying. So she actually used to write to her mother and never used to get any replies. And all she wants to know is when her birthday is. She doesn't even know when her birthday is. So that's quite a sad story as well. But she owns this shebeen, right? And so they're drinking there, but now the three of them are sitting down except Boston. Boston is saying, what does it prove that I was sick? Okay, so after they did the job on the train, Boston went and vomited in the gutter. In the gutter. Okay. And he's saying, well, what does it prove? Now, the others think, except for maybe Tsotsi, I don't know. Tsotsi probably thinks so as well, actually. They think that he's sick, like his stomach sick. Okay. We know that the reason why he's vomiting is because he's sick to his heart, his soul. The fact that this good guy, Gumboot, was like killed for no reason whatsoever, just for a pay packet. Okay, and it makes him sick to his stomach. Alright. But he obviously doesn't want to say that at this point. But he would like to say it. He would like to say it. Okay. And it talks about on page 14 how there were plenty of places to drink. And there were like little shebeens popping up all over the place. And in this shebeen at the back there was another room where Suki slept and ate and stuff. So she like lives there as well. Okay. But Boston's agitated and he's got like spit on his lips and hasn't sat down. He's wide-eyed and all that. He's walking aimlessly around the room. And they just keep drinking. The others just keep drinking and drinking, and they keep calling Suki all the time to come fill up her glass fill up his glass and stuff like that. And that irritates Boston as well. He's like, why don't you just go and get it yourself, And going to Suki's, it says on page 16, Tsotsi had said to himself, I will do exactly the same as I always do. It was that simple. In other words, don't even think about what you've done. Don't think about what you've done or what you're going to do or who you are or anything like that. You just do the same as you. You do your job, you go there, you drink. That's it. Then it says that he hated Boston. That was why he had chosen to take one on the trains, because of Boston. Boston had been with them 6 months now. It had been all right before him. But when Boston came, it had begun. And Tsotsi knew why. It was because of his questions. The first question that Boston asked Tsotsi after a few days of joining the gang was, what's your name, your real name? And that annoyed him. That annoyed Tsotsi. Nobody asks him questions. In fact, the Arb told Boston how much Tsotsi hated questions about himself. Okay. Boston drinks a lot, especially after jobs, as it says, as we discussed on page 16. So the reason why Tsotsi chooses jobs now is to irritate Boston in a sense. He tried, because he hates Boston, so he thinks that like when they do these terrible jobs, it messes up Boston, and he enjoys that, and also causes Boston to talk and to question. Now he doesn't like people questioning him, but it says on page 17, it made Tsotsi realize that he saw it. Then Boston ventured tentatively from silence to the spoken word. Okay. Now, in the corner of, we don't see it in this picture, but in the corner of this shebeen at Suki's place is a woman who's like half zonked out of her mind. Okay, her name is Rosie, or Rose, and she was there when they got there, but she's obviously probably a prostitute. We can assume she's in this drunken haze, and it just goes to show her pointless existence. That she's been forced to turn to prostitution for some form of income. She's been abused. She's just lying there now. She's got nothing to do, nowhere to go. And Suki tells her to leave, but she doesn't. And eventually, while Boston and Tsotsi are talking, or should I say Boston is talking, Suki's not really saying, Tsotsi is not really saying much. Boston and Tsotsi are talking. The other two actually take Rosie outside and go and rape her, and of course nobody does anything to stop them. So that just shows you the lifestyle in the township there as well. But what really irritates Boston so much is the fact that Tsotsi doesn't have any decency. That word is important, decency. And he asks Tsotsi, do you know that word, decency? Of course, Tsotsi doesn't know what decency means. Tsotsi thinks, oh my God, here he's coming with these words again. And on page 18 it says, books and words, I wipe my backside with books and words. Tsotsi thinks it's a sickness. Boston's trying to explain to him what it feels like to have a conscience. He says, I had a little bit of it, so I was sick. That big bastard had a lot of it, so he's dead. Right. So Boston is the one who has the most amount of decency. In other words, he feels what he's doing is wrong. He has a moral compass. Okay. Then he starts asking Tsotsi questions again, which is not a good thing. He says, how old are you? And page 19, middle of the page is quite important. It said, Tsotsi hated the questions for a profound but simple reason. He didn't know the answers. He didn't know his name. He doesn't know his age. He doesn't know any of the other answers that men assemble and shape into the semblance of a life. His memory went back vaguely to a group of young boys scavenging the townships for scraps needed to keep alive. So he has a vague memory of being a young boy, homeless, looking for things to eat along the streets and stuff like that of the township. Before that, a few vague, moody memories, a police chase, which we can maybe discuss later, and finding himself alone. Tsotsi didn't know because he had never been told, and if he had once known, he no longer remembered. And his not knowing himself had a deeper meaning than his name and his age. He allowed himself no thought of himself. He remembered no yesterdays, and tomorrow existed only when it was the present living moment. He was as old as that moment, and his name was the name in a way of all men. Okay, so unlike you and me, who we are, and particularly our name, something as simple as our name, our age, where we come from, the memories that we have, our childhood, that all creates who we are as a person. But because Tsotsi doesn't know his name or his age or his story of his childhood or anything really, I mean, he knows a little bit, but he pushes those memories aside on purpose. Because he doesn't know that, he can't create an image of himself. It's difficult. He can't look in the mirror and say, this is me, because he doesn't know who me is. So he's had to create an image so that he has one. So the gangster image is an identity, and that's all he knows. But you see, that's going to change as the novel progresses. So they keep on having this conversation where Boston's now getting under Tsotsi's skin. And page 22, Boston says, well, do you not ever feel anything? Do you not feel that like big one tonight? Or that poor bitch out there? He's referring to Rosie, who Butcher and Diop have taken outside to go and rape. He says, don't you feel anything? Then he takes out a knife. Now, this is a broken bottle, but that's incorrect. Okay, he takes out a knife, his knife, and he cuts himself a little bit. And he says, I can feel that. Like, that's physical pain. So, like, he's trying to explain to Tsotsi how it feels. So he says, okay, well, Tsotsi knows everything about pain, so he'll know that if I cut myself, physical representation of pain, he can understand that. Then he says, like, well, that's what it felt like me inside when we did that guy tonight. And he then says to Tsotsi, like, don't you feel anything for anyone? Is there not a woman in your life that you've felt for? Is there not a dog even, or a sister? You must have a soul. Everybody's got a soul. Every living being has got a soul. An important emphasis on the word soul there. I've bolded it too. Now, Tsotsi's had enough. He can't actually stand it anymore because he's been asked these questions. He doesn't have people to ask him questions because it's making him think of his childhood, and it's making him angry and sad that he doesn't have those memories, that he doesn't have that empathy and that idea of identity of who he is, right? So he takes a swing at Boston, and Boston goes to the floor, right? Then Boston says, well, you'll feel something one day, Tsotsi, one day it's going to happen, and God help you that day, because when it comes You won't know what to do. You won't know what to do with that feeling. And that's when Tsotsi really gets into Boston and starts kicking him numerous times. And eventually Diop and Butcher come and they tear him off Boston, and Tsotsi leaves the room. That ends chapter 2. Sorry for the gore. There's Boston lying on the floor, obviously, and that's Suki over there saying he must never come back again, and things like that. Okay. I don't see that in the novel. I know that happens in the movie, though. Oh, here on page 25, it says Suki was telling them to take the unconscious man out of her place. Okay, I think that's all pretty much it says about that. Anyway, she's obviously a little bit annoyed. Chapter 3, he's now walking out of the shebeen. He's walking down the street. Tsotsi knew the others had pulled him off before he had finished. He wanted to keep on beating him. He wanted to work a long time on Boston. He had only started. He was not released from the torment of his hate. And then he starts thinking over and over, playing in his mind those words of Boston. One day, God help you that day. One day you won't know what to do, etc., etc. And it annoys him. So he's now near a lamppost which is creating some light. And there's men there throwing dice for money and things like that. And then they see him and then they put their money away because they know he's a gangster and they're like worried he's going to come and steal from them. And then he carries on walking, and then he gets to a corner where there's a church. It says it's cross affirming that God moved amongst men that night. There he threw back his head and ran. Yes, God did move among men that night, but we don't know exactly what that means yet. We will find that out. And so he starts running, and then in a few seconds away he was at the end of the street, and like a buck he leapt through the last of the light and into the darkness that ringed the township, marking its limits in the start of the no man's land between it and the wiped suburb. So we have this township, and then we have essentially a no man's land, like a gap of nothingness, and then we have the white suburbs. And he starts running towards the wiped suburbs. And, he's trying to do this to force himself to not think. He thinks if he runs fast enough and you get really tired and you're gasping for air and that, your only thought is, I can't breathe, I'm tired, I need to stop, and not all the other things. Because now Boston has triggered in him, and this is why he doesn't want people to ask him questions, thoughts about who he is and where his life is going, and this identity that he lacks and things like that. So it makes him angry. He gets into the white suburb, and it says it was suddenly a white world, a prismatic, polished, gleaming world of white surfaces, the streets, the moon-washed walls, and the rooftops almost a glacial white. White surfaces, a literal sense, but also white as in privileged and actual white people living there. It was like two completely different worlds back then. And it also talks about that the crickets were coming out, how it was like nice and quiet, and it was raining, but because of the moonlight, the crickets came out once the rain stopped, and the whole atmosphere of it. There was a bell somewhere ringing. The whole atmosphere is completely different. In that world, in that setting, it would be easy to be somebody else. He's saying in the township you don't have a choice. You have to be this person, have this gangster identity, or not necessarily a gangster, but an identity, and one that's not like in the white suburbs, because you obviously have more opportunities and things like that. And he goes, and this is where the movie is very different, okay? He goes into a grove of blue gum trees because he's obviously very, very tired at this point. And he goes to rest because now he wants to rest. All right. Unfortunately, it says here, he sat down with his back to a tree, and no sooner was he comfortable than he regretted it, because immediately the image of Boston rose up before him. I shouldn't have stopped here, he thought. I should have kept on until I could go no more. All right. He's like, damn it. As soon as he stops to catch his breath, he already starts thinking about what he's just heard from Boston and the whole situation and what's happened. And he thinks to himself, damn it, I should have just kept on going until I couldn't go anymore. Just like completely just out of frustration, like run and run and run. Then it talks about Boston's virtue. Boston's virtue was that he was clever on page 29. He was a lot of other things as well. He was a coward. Boston was weak. He talked too much. He drank even more than he talked. But more important than anything else, he was clever. He could think. Boston had already proved himself 100 times over. In as many jobs, his cleverness had engineered success. The little details that got you caught, these Boston thought about. In a panic of fear, it was true, but he thought about them, and that was all that mattered. So one of the reasons why they keep Boston around is because he's clever, and so they'll say, okay, we have this plan to go and do X, Y, Z, and Boston will be the one who'll say, that's not going to work, we could get caught doing that, and then he comes up with a solution. So he's proved himself many times that he is an asset to the gang. Then it says, Tsotsi, when he thought of himself inwardly, he thought of darkness. Okay. Darkness, something like the midnight hour, only more obscure. At night, when he lay on his bed, it was almost one continuum of obscurity, as dark without as within, the separation being his flesh. In other words, yes, he's dark on the outside, but he's dark on the inside because it's like hollow, it's like emptiness. Yes, it's dark because he does evil things and he's a murderer and a killer and all that. But also emptiness because he doesn't know who he is. There's just a hole inside. He lacks those memories. He lacks that childhood. He lacks that identity and all the things that go with it. Then, very important, it says that he lived according to a set of tried and tested rules. There are 3 rules that he lives by. The first one, before anything else, before eating, before washing, excuse the language, before pissing, he had to see to his knife. It was a sheath knife, the blade 4 inches long. He carried it in the back pocket of his trousers, and he slept with it under his jacket, which he rolled up and used as a pillow. So when he wakes up in the morning, the first thing he does is look for his knife, because the knife is a purpose. He knows how to use it. It's something that's familiar to him. It forms part of who he is. Right. It even says there that if he used to wake up and it needed sharpening, he would spit on it in a stone and sharpen it. And even if it didn't need sharpening, he would simply play with it a few seconds, enjoying the security of it in his hand. The second rule that he lives by is never to disrupt his inward darkness with the light of a thought about himself or the attempt at a memory. He didn't want to know anything. Okay. You see, if he thinks about himself, it can make him lose the identity of the gangster that he has. Then he'll be stuck between half a gangster and half of who he used to be. And it will also make him soft, and he doesn't want to change who he is. We get used to it as human beings. We get comfortable with the known. We don't like getting out of our comfort zone. And for him, trying to think back to his past of something that he can't really figure out, that is definitely out of his comfort zone. So the simplest thing is to not think about it at all. Then it goes on about how the time he and Diop and Butcher were rolling dice near the station, and Butcher nudged him, and all 3 of them looked up, and there was a policeman there walking down the road, and in one hand he had a bicycle, and in the other hand he was dragging a man in a jacket who was handcuffed. And they all laughed and whatever, but this man, this is a memory now, this man goes and says to Tsotsi, David, it's me, Peter, help me, David. But Tsotsi closed his ears, he heard it no more, he forgot it right there and then. So that memory that he thinks of now is actually telling us and him that your name is David. He knows his name is David, actually. But because there where it says he heard it no more, he forgot it right there and then, means he didn't entertain that thought at all. He just moved on straight away. That incident and the memories that it evoked was the furthest Tsotsi had ever gone back into his past. Okay, so that whole memory of them playing dice and seeing this man being dragged with a bicycle by a policeman and him calling David, help me and stuff like that. Now, the guy was probably, or Peter is his name, was probably one of the kids that grew up with Tsotsi when he didn't have a home, But Tsotsi has blocked that memory out of his mind, or that part of his life out of his mind. And then the third rule is Tsotsi tolerated no questions from another. It wasn't just that he was caught without answers, it went deeper than that. Those questions sounded the vast depths of his darkness, making it a tangible reality. To know nothing about yourself is to be constantly in danger of nothingness, those voids of non-being over which a man walks the tightrope of his life. Tsotsi feared nothingness. He feared it because he believed in it. Even more than that, he knew with all the certainty of his being that behind the facade of life lurked nothing. Under men's prayers he had heard the deep silence of it, etc., etc. It then tells us on page 33 that Tsotsi is not good at thinking. The reason why he's not good at thinking is because he doesn't allow himself to think much. He then stands up because he wants to run away again. And he starts moving. And then he hears a sound. And so he sneaks back into the shadows. Now this is from the movie. There's no car. There's no like kind of big house like this or whatever the case is. This over here is a blue gum grove, like a forest. Okay. So I've put a big cross over here. There's no car. Alright. What he does here though is a young woman, or he sees a young woman, a black woman, coming towards him in the night. She's wearing a long coat, unbuttoned, and underneath you could see a white garment that could have been a petticoat. She carried a shoebox with her. It then says Tsotsi recognized without hesitation the symptoms of fear. Well, at this point as the reader, we're not sure why she's scared. We will find out what she's up to. But with Athol Fugard saying that without hesitation the symptoms of fear means that Tsotsi is so well aware of what fear looks like because he's seen it so many times when he's mugged and killed people. It's a familiar expression to him. She held her parcel as if it were her last hold on life itself. Then he decides that he's going to come and catch this woman. So he slipped slyly from tree to the point where she would enter the grove. He didn't know what he was going to do, but his fingers flexed at his side. His hands were ready. This is what he's used to, stalking people like this. She then crosses the street and walks into the grove of the blue gum trees. He catches her by one arm, swings her around. He then forces her against a tree. And, as the reader, we might think, oh, he's going to rape her now. But he doesn't. We don't really know what his intentions were because we don't get to find out. Because what she does is she stops screaming because he puts his one hand over her mouth so she can't scream. And when he does that, she takes a step back and then she kind of, with a sudden thrust, just puts this shoebox into his hands and then leaves. She runs back from where she came from, crying. Now, during this, the lid of the shoebox falls off, and Tsotsi is a little bit shocked with what he sees. He's so shocked with what is in the shoebox that he doesn't even do anything. He doesn't even try and catch her or chase her or anything like that. She just disappears into the darkness, into the light, into the night, and he hears the sound as well as seeing what he thinks he sees, and it's true what he sees. He sees a baby. And what had happened was that the woman was carrying this baby in the shoebox, and she's dumped it in his hands for reasons that we can discuss and debate. And off she goes. What was she doing there with the baby in the first place? Probably can't afford it, or doesn't want it, or can't feed it, or whatever the case is, and hoping to dump it at somebody's door so that they will adopt or take the baby in. We don't know. But now this is what Tsotsi is left with, a baby in a shoebox.